My name is Andrew Todd, and I'm here today to introduce you to Roger Rule, author of The Rifleman's Rifle, and host of this series of episodes, Special Guns with Roger Rule.
Thank you, Andrew. And let me welcome you, the viewers, to our second episode of Special Guns with Roger Rule.
Roger, let me ask you first, what is your definition for special guns?
For this series, special guns are simply guns that a gun enthusiast may have heard of but never encountered. And for my selection, I narrow the focus down to those arms that hold an evolutionary or revolutionary place in the world of modern sporting arms over the last 2 centuries and have since become sort of classics because of it. I'd like to add that while my earliest expertise is recognized for the Winchester Pre-64 Model 70, that was 40 years ago. During the last 30 years or so, I've been involved in all types of and grades of shotguns and rifles, including those strange 3 and 4 barreled guns called Veerlings and Drillings. For today's episode, I want to introduce you to a rifle made by John Rigby and Company of London, the oldest English maker still operating today. But before we get to the rifle, let's look a little at the history of this maker. And before we get to the maker, you should know that gun makers in the UK and gun makers in America are very different animals. Most commercial gun makers in America build all their own parts, use their own designs or those of others whose patents have expired, but basically build the guns totally in-house. In England, gun makers have always been smaller businesses, much like our own custom gun makers here, and many of their key parts for their guns are outsourced from specialized makers. For instance, actions intended for a bolt-action rifle by a British maker have always been outsourced. The most common action is an 1898 Mauser action, either the commercial version by Mauser in Orbendorf, Germany, or the FN version from Fabrique Nationale in Belgium. Another popular one used by many different British makers was the Mannlicher Schonauer action made in Austria. And over the years, I've seen Rigby's made with Sacco actions, with Winchester Pre-64 Model 70 actions, and even with military Mauser actions.
But if they are considered the gun maker, what is it that they do?
Well, just like our custom gun makers in the American Custom Gun Makers Guild, the British firms then refine the action and build a rifle entirely by hand. If engraving is involved, most of that is outsourced today with many of the makers using the same engravers.
You said John Rigby and Company is the oldest British maker?
In the heyday of the gunmaker period in Great Britain, 1850 to 1925, you could find gun makers in scores of towns and villages all over England, Ireland, and Scotland. But I have chosen Rigby especially today because of their longevity. Their date of foundation is 1735, long before anyone ever heard of the United States of America. The company was founded in Dublin, Ireland. While the Dublin location was renowned for their firearms workmanship, it was their excellent dueling pistols and the day of the percussion pistols that put them on the map. Rigby had developed these pistol locks with an additional notch to let the cock be raised slightly above the percussion cap to allow the weapon to be safely carried with the cap in place. In 1860, John Rigby devised a method of forming cartridge cases from coiled sheet brass. At an important date, 1866, the company opened their location in London. From that time, Rigby's match rifles were used in the great rifle competitions throughout the second half of the 19th century. When one thought of shotguns, there were many competing makers all over London. But when one thought of rifles, Rigby was the house. The first Creedmoor match, a 1,000-yard match, took place in 1874. The world record-holding Irish team was challenged by an American rifle team made up of 6 Americans shooting 3 Sharps and 3 Remington rolling blocks. The 6 Irish members shot Rigby target rifles. The rolling blocks turned in the best scores of the day, with John Bodine shooting his rolling block in the winning round, and the Americans won barely, 934 to 931. By the way, one of the Irish shooters in that match was Daniel Fraser. We will be discussing much more about him in a later episode. Then in 1879, John Rigby and an employee, T. Bissell, patented the iconic rising bite action for their double rifle. It had a unique third locking system, adding a vertical bolt in addition to the 1863 Purdy double underlug system, making it one of the strongest double rifles ever devised. Then near the end of the 19th century, Rigby's reputation expanded, becoming renowned for manufacturing best quality sporting shotguns in addition to their extremely fine rifles. That first London address became quite prestigious, 72 St. James's Street. It was one of the more famous streets in London, associated with many VIPs, including Sir Isaac Newton, much earlier. From 1898 to 1912, Rigby held the exclusive British distributorship for Mauser actions and was responsible in getting Mauser to build a large Magnum action for their now world-famous proprietary cartridge, the .416 Rigby, something we will discuss in depth in our next episode. Then in 1908, Rigby moved to 43 Sackville Street and remained there until 1955. During this period, the company was under the management of Ernest John Rigby, grandson of the founder. In 1925 and 1926, Rigby used the much sought-after Mauser square bridge Magnum actions. Those Mauser actions made before Oberndorf closed the doors the first time number only about 127,000, and more than 82,000 were sold prior to World War I, with most of them going to the British trade. For a long dry spell, but during the wars, Oberndorf Mauser actions were not available, and during that time the British makers turned to surplus military Mauser actions, and later to other commercial Mauser actions like the FN Mauser and the Zastava Mark X. From 43 Sackville Street, they moved several times, and the addresses and dates are important to gun collectors because their address was inscribed on their rifles and shotguns, and knowing the dates of each address clearly helps pinpoint the manufacturer of a gun. For example, in 1955, they left the Sackville address and moved to 32 King Street, St. James's. In 1963, the shop moved again back to Sackville Street, but this time to 28 Sackville Street, then moved again in 1969 to 13 Pall Mall, London. In 1984, J. Roberts & Son bought the company, and in the following year moved them to the premises of 5 King Street, Covent Garden, London. 3 years later, in 1987, the factory and shop moved again to 66-68 Great Suffolk Street, Southwark, London. It was at the Great Suffolk Street address that I first visited Rigby in 1993. I found their address was across the river from where all the other gun makers are in London, Holland & Holland, Purdy, John Wilkes at that time, William Evans, and Boss. Being across the river, I had to take a taxi, and the cab driver told me it was going to be on the right as we got near the address. I saw this light industrial building. The entrance was pretty obvious because there was an intercom system. When I pressed the button, the voice inside asked me if I had an appointment. Of course I didn't, and I identified who I was, said I was from the U.S., and I had been an author of a couple of gun books and was there to gather information for a magazine article. So there was a little delay, and then she buzzed me in. As soon as I came in, they introduced me to the then manager, David Marks. He was very courteous. He showed me around, showed me the operations. We chatted. He took me upstairs. I saw some tables with some gunsmiths working, employees, maybe they were gunsmiths. And when we passed by one gun, David told me it was a pre-order for a 416 Rigby, a bolt-action rifle, which caught my interest. At the end of that meeting, he gave me this very nice brochure, which was just beautiful. It was all black with all the guns were in color and just looked stunning on it. And as I was going out the door, it dawned on me I'd come by cab. So I turned back to the woman in a nearby desk and asked if I could use a phone, call a cab. Being in a light industrial area, I knew there were probably no cabs available to hail down. And she said, she just smiled and said, the London Taxi Company of all London was headquartered right across the street. And I opened the door. These doors didn't have windows, by the way. I opened the door, and diagonally across the street were all kinds of numbers of cabs going in and out. And I felt kind of, duh, I hadn't seen that at all coming in there. A few years after my visit, the goodwill and rights to the Rigby name were purchased. I think that was in 1997 by Rogue River Rifle Works, and a new company, John Rigby and Company Incorporated, was formed and commenced their activities under the Rigby name in the United States, actually in Paso Robles, California. The locals just call it Paso Robles. Curiously enough, while in Paso Robles, I visited them again in 2003. This time I took a master gunsmith friend of mine, and we flew in and arranged a limo type cab service from a small airport to their address. The local driver had never heard of John Rigby and Company, which surprised me since they'd been there for 6 years or so, and because Paso Robles is not a very large community. This time, though, they were expecting us, and we were met at the door by Jeffrey Miller, who gave us a pleasant tour of their operation. When we left their premises, my gunsmith friend told me that he thought they were outsourcing much of their work, and as it turns out, the amount outsourced seems to have been much more than we even suspected. Eventually, we would hear they had developed some real problems during that ownership. However, on March 1, 2013, just winding up this history, John Rigby and Company was purchased again, this time by the very established gunmaking firm of Blaser of Germany. They restructured the Rigby Company, and it's now back in London and under the direction of Mark Newton and Patricia Pugh, and they are attempting to rekindle the great name of Rigby and continue to make best guns. Their showroom and museum is located at 13-19 Pinsbury Place in London.
That is one long history with a lot of moving around.
Yes, the second half of the 20th century had been lean years for the finest handmade guns, but over the years, moving or not, Rigby has become world famous. They are one of the few British gunmaker firms with a trademark, a logo with back-to-back R's. They led in the race to supply double rifles to the British gentry for safaris in their Commonwealth of India and Africa, introducing the 450 Nitro Express rifle and the Great Rising Bite double rifles. In 1911, that's when they introduced their Great 416 Rigby for magazine rifles and got Mauser to build the Magnum Mauser action to handle it. According to Frank Barnes, in his book Cartridges of the World, he stated, and I quote, "The 416 Rigby is probably the best magazine cartridge for big game ever offered," close quote. The 416 Rigby has lasted well, not only because it's the original one in 416, but also because it has a non-belted case, which allows it to feed smoothly through the action. The other 416s are belted cartridges. And according to Jeffrey Boothroyd about John Rigby and Company in his book, Sidelocks and Box Locks, and I quote, "It is for their work in connection with the manufacture of sporting rifles, both double and magazine, that the firm is perhaps best known," close quote.
What is a magazine rifle?
A magazine rifle is a British term for what we call a bolt-action rifle. The London trade built great single shots, usually called stocking rifles, and great double-barrel guns, just called double rifles. And since their only repeating actions that most of them built were bolt-action rifles, having a magazine as opposed to not having one for the single shots and double rifles, they just adopted the name for them as magazine rifles to differentiate from their other rifles. This is pretty consistent from maker to maker. And that is exactly what I have for us today. Not only a best quality magazine rifle by John Rigby and Company, excuse me, but a special custom order one built with such extras that Rigby referred to it as their light deluxe model.
With that long history, how old is this rifle?
This rifle was built by John Rigby and Company in 1984, some 32 years ago. But as you can see, it's nearly in mint condition. Marketed as a light deluxe model, this one is chambered in .30-06 caliber, which you can see is clearly stated in gold on the floor plate. Check to see this unloaded. I'm going to release the bolt stop, take the bolt out, set the rifle down, and show you that it has the long extractor, which is a Mauser action, and this is a snap cap, not a live cartridge. When I put it on the bolt face, it holds it, showing you that it's a control feed action. Put the bolt back in, insert it back in the action. The safety's on fire. I put the snap cap in, load it like a cartridge. I can now pull the trigger. Doesn't hurt the gun. It's called dry firing up without live ammunition, but with the snap cap it protects the striker. When I pull the bolt up and flip it out, it will come out fast. If I pull it fast, it'll come out really slow if I pull it out, and if I move it slow. Also checking to see if there's any cartridges left in it. You can empty the magazine by pressing a little center bow release. And this is called a straddle hinged floor plate. Also, while I have it here in front of me, you can see the gold Rigby and .30-06 gold filled on the floor plate. Looking at the barrel inscriptions, we see the address 13 Pall Mall, London, which would tell us this rifle was made during the period when Rigby was located at that address from 1969 to 1985. At this point, I should tell you that I had communication with about this rifle with Rigby's current gunroom manager, David Miles, and discovered that this light deluxe magazine rifle serial number 6395 was built on a true Mauser action for John Kessler in April 1984. Another year or two later, and the street address would have been the King Street address. So from Mr. Miles' report, we can see that this action is the commercial large ring Mauser action. Commercial as opposed to military because there's no thumb cutout in the rear receiver bridge for military loading, and the floor plate is the one-piece straddle hinged floor plate with center bow release, the commercial type instead of the military non-hinged floor plate. And being custom made, one of the first things I notice about this altered Mauser action is that it features a 3-position side swing safety fashioned after the Winchester 364 Model 70, We talked about the function of that safety in my first episode. Excuse me. The reason for this change is that the old Mauser safety, while an excellent safety, operated very awkwardly when manipulated under a scope. The new redesigned safety by Winchester worked smoothly under a scope, and I see where even Mauser is now including this change on most of their current production of big bore rifles. Also altered is the shape of the bolt handle. Instead of being straight down like typical of most Mausers, it has been lowered for scope clearance and curved to the rear, similar to those found on FN Mauser action.
What makes this rifle the light deluxe model?
Several features, Andrew. To understand them, we need to know the differences between this model and the standard or sporting rifle model. I don't have a sporting rifle here today, but it's easy to show the differences as I point them out on this rifle. This is called a Monte Carlo comb. Classic comb just goes straight back. Monte Carlo is a raised comb, raised enough to align your eye with a telescope, but the butt goes back down to fit the position of your shoulder. And the deluxe models are more known to have the Monte Carlo stocks than the standard. The standards have the classic straight line stock, typically. Another thing that makes this one a light deluxe, I'll show you the camera, is the skeleton butt plate. It's got checkered wood in between the metalwork. That's hand checkered. And the screws, there are 4 screws. They have slots that are all aligned. Those are called indexed in the industry, and that's a very custom feature. You would never find that on the standard rifle unless it was special ordered, which any of these features can be special ordered on a standard rifle. Well, here, while I have it, after the butt plate, I should point out this Monte Carlo comb has a cheek piece. The cheek piece is not found on the standard rifle, and it's not only a nice sculptured cheek piece, but it has what's called a beaded line around it, or what's sometimes called a shadow line, and this one is very well done by Rigby. The standard rifle didn't even have a cheek piece. Also, there's a gold oval in the toe line for the initials or monogram of the owner. That was not on a standard rifle unless it was special ordered. Moving forward is the pistol grip cap that's made out of horn. It has a screw and the screw's engraved. On the standard rifle, it was typically a rounded, called a round knob pistol grip, until they fell out of favor, and then Rigby started putting a pistol grip cap on the standard one as well. Next would be the talking about the buffalo horn here. The little tip on the end is also buffalo horn. It's called a forearm tip, and standard rifle had no forearm tip at all. It's just walnut rounded out to the end. However, Rigby used horn or ebony, and sort of interchangeably, and I think it was based on the availability of the material. Next would be the hand checkering that makes a difference. Now, the checkering on the standard rifle is every bit the quality that the checkering on the Deluxe is, because it's a best made gun. However, the checkering on the Deluxe is more generous. It's usually a wrap-around checkering, or at least the 2 panels on the wrist are tied together, and it's a full wrap-around checkering on the forearm. Standard rifle does not have that much checkering. But probably the biggest thing about the stock, that's the difference between the 2 guns, is the grade of wood. On the standard rifle, it was a very plain grade of wood, usually nice color, dark, but very little wood figure. On the Deluxe, it would have fancy figure, either dark streaks like this one, or fiddleback like this one also has, or stump figure. This one doesn't have that. Or marble cake. There's a lot of different types of fancy figure. This one actually has two, the dark streaks and the fiddleback, and it has them on both sides and kind of even on both profiles, which would make it probably a pretty unusual piece of wood for 1984, because wood was hard to find in that era. Good wood. For the metal work, from my observations of several guns in the past, there's no difference in the bluing between the sporting rifle and the Deluxe model. The bluing for both of them is a slow rust process that requires several baths and polishing and yields the highest quality of soft blue. The barrel length is 24 inches on this gun. The bottom metal is, as I've already said, the one-piece straddle hinge floor plate with the center bow release. You press the release and the floor plate swings out with the magazine spring and the follower to unload fired cartridges. But the bottom metal on many of the standard sporters was the military Mauser's unhinged floor plate. The front sight is a 6.5 millimeter silver bead mounted on a barrel banded short ramp with a folding hood to protect the sight. The folding hood operates with a push button release. The rear sight on the rifle is a typical express sight, which offers a choice of two leaves, one standing and one folding, mounted on a block commonly called an island in the industry. Focusing on some of the inscriptions, besides the gold-filled maker's name and caliber designation on the floor plate, the serial numbers engraved on the trigger guard, and we see a proof mark on the right side of the barrel over the chamber. It is the symbol of an arm holding a cutlass with the letters NP under it. This is the London Definitive Nitro proof mark for all guns since 1904, according to the proof mark listing in the Blue Book of Gun Values. Underneath the proof mark, it is stamped with what was proved. The caliber, 30-06, the length of the chamber, 2.49 inches, and under that, the proof load tested, 18 tons. And under that, the word London. All the metalwork discussed so far is similar between the sporting rifle and the Deluxe model. The metalwork that is different for the Deluxe model from the standard rifle comprises two main areas: the gold-filled maker's name and caliber designation on the floor plate, and saving the best for last, the most significant difference of the Deluxe model over the standard sporting rifle is the engraving. The standard rifle may, at most, have Rigby's name, the barrel address, inscription, caliber designation engraved, but the Deluxe models, like this one, will have much more metal engraving. Over the years, several options have been available, and I've seen significant differences among the few Deluxe models that I've encountered. On this rifle, the most noticeable engraving that catches the eye immediately would be what we've already discussed. The floor plate's contrasting gold-filled lettering showing the maker's name and caliber designation. There is really no fancy engraving on the barrel other than the address, which we've already covered, and the bolt and bolt assembly have no engraving. But for the bottom metal, besides the gold-filled lettering, the trigger guard and floor plate have scroll engraving very nicely done. The screws for the pistol grip cap and the bottom metal are also engraved and indexed. And for the remainder of the receiver of the action, there are 6 patterns of nicely sharp scrollwork engraving. One at the rear where the bolt meets the receiver when raised, 2 at a large pattern on the left side in the center of the receiver between the bridges, and then 3 and 4, 2 small linear patterns of engraving on each top side edge of the rear receiver bridge, and finally 5 and 6, 2 full-size engravings on both sides of the front receiver ring. Interestingly, the engraving on the right front receiver ring surrounds a London proof mark with the word London under it. And on the left receiver ring under the engraving is the inscription Made in England. And then common to both the Deluxe model and the sporting rifle are sling eyes, which are usually found on either model in this arrangement. The front sling eye on the barrel and the rear sling eye located about 2.5 inches from the toe. Speaking of measurements, the length of pull, or LOP, of this rifle is 14.5 inches, about an inch more than the factory Winchester P64 Model 70 and the Dakota rifles. The weight of this rifle is 7 pounds 3 ounces without scope and 8 pounds 14 ounces with a scope. Let me show you how this system works, because it's a nifty system. There's a little lever here. You press it up, the scope can swing out and off, similar to a Redfield Junior mount in that regard. Putting it back on just goes right back into the slot, usually easier than this, and then turns back till you hear the click, and then it's in perfect zero again. It's a really easy system to take off and on, and for someone experienced with it, easier than I just demonstrated. While this rifle's chambered in .30-06, I'd like to mention a little about the cartridge. Most of you are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, I want to point out that it originated as a U.S. military cartridge, a .30 caliber cartridge, adopted in 1906, hence the name, for our Springfield rifle clear back in World War I. It was still with us in World War II in the great M1 Grand rifle. Many hunters and gun writers over the years have found this cartridge with the right load combination to be adequate for any game in North or South America. And with so many ex-soldiers familiar with it, so many surplus rifles available, it became popular, so popular, that the commercial makers built rifles for it soon after World War I. At that time, in bolt actions, there were the Winchester Model 54, the Remington Model 30, and Savage had two models, 40 and 45. Winchester also chambered it for their lever action Model 95, and before long there were pump actions and semi-autos available. While very common now worldwide for Rigby in the list of common calibers chambered by them, it falls into the list as not that common. From most common to least, here's the list from Rigby. 275 Rigby, which is their 7mm Mauser, they just renamed it. 270 Winchester, 300 H&H Magnum, 375 H&H Magnum, 7x6 303 British, 30-06, 416 Rigby, 350 Rigby, and then there's others. This rifle is accompanied with a hard case. There are several issues about the case that make me suspect that it's not original to the gun. For one thing, it's very new. Of course, the rifle is too. For another, it has a combination lock, and although that lock was invented in 1978, I'm not sure it was available for Rigby cases by 1984. Since the case is large enough for the scope, that makes me think the case was purchased after the scope was selected and installed. Usually, Rigby cases are made without the provision for a scope. However, there is one thing about that would support the originality. The label is not a copy. It's original. When you rub your fingers over the lettering, you can feel the lettering. The letters are embossed in the label. Excuse me. All label copies I've seen are just desktop printed copies without the embossing. If you want to check out Rigby, they are still in business, now back in London, as our historical account showed. And you can find them on www.johnrigbyandcoforcompany.com. Their website shows some beautiful guns, including their pricing. That's it for today. Thank you, Andrew, for joining me. Thank you, viewers, for watching. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and share it with others. I hope you can Join me next week for another episode of Special Guns with Roger Rule. We'll be looking at a beautiful Magnum Mauser action bolt. If you want to get involved with these types of guns, I recommend gunsinternational.com. The owners are great people. I know them and have been using their website since they started. I find it the best source for both buying and selling any great collectible gun.
Oh!